Hello and welcome to Phosphorus Live. This is our bi-weekly look at the very interesting world of XIoT, the Extended Internet of Things. I'm your host, Mike Huckaby. I'm the VP of Sales Engineering here at Phosphorus, and I'm joined by our device-obsessed Director of Sales Engineering, James McCarthy, who are you just hearing from? Go ahead and say hi, James.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, we're happy to have you join us. We get together like this every 2 weeks to provide some education on the connected devices that we all use to run our businesses on these days, and to give some insight into what Phosphorus does to help keep those devices secure. Format simple: quick discussion on a specific topic, and then a Phosphorus technical take related to that topic. It's a quick hit, less than 30 minutes, and we'll include some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom that you can input those in. We're happy to interact with you, be part of the conversation today. And our topic for today: the continuing problem with firmware, SSwHat. But before we get into that, James, what's happening at the XIoT news desk?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple interesting things today. So XIoT-based vulnerabilities continue to trend in the wrong direction, as we're all pretty well aware. Historically, IT assets comprise the majority of known vulnerabilities at any given time. However, those numbers are starting to change. And actually, in 2023, 78% of all known vulnerabilities in the world were associated to IT assets, traditional IT assets, servers, desktops, laptops. Compare that to today. So just 1 year's worth of change. XIoT vulnerabilities are up 130%, 136% year over year. And now what used to be 78% of all known vulnerabilities being IT related is actually down to only 58%. So by this time next year, it's very possible that XIoT-based vulnerabilities will account for the majority of the world's risk. So start patching now and get ahead of that trend for sure. I thought that was just interesting to show the trending direction of the vulnerability world and how IoT is just, every day getting more and more a part of that picture. But keeping with the topic of vulnerabilities, a new bug was actually discovered earlier this year with the Bosch, I think it's the BCC 100 thermostats. You see these most commonly in the hospitality space, hotels, and even in some hospitals. We see a trend in the healthcare industry where more and more they're trying to treat patient rooms as kind of a hospitality experience with nice infotainment systems and better control over temperatures and things like that. But with this vulnerability, an attacker can actually gain local unauthorized access, allowing them to modify the underlying firmware or even upload their own compromised version to the controller itself. There's even potential for an attacker to fully brick the device, preventing users from modifying the temperature settings of the device. While this may make some hotel guests uncomfortable, the real risk lies in the ability for the attacker to actually use the device to pivot onto a network in order to cause greater harm. Bosch released a firmware fix, not too long after, and obviously they're recommending to all of their customers that they go out and patch immediately because, unfortunately, this is the type of vulnerability where you don't have to have physical access to the device. And so that's the big threat there, is that somebody can get onto a network through traditional methods and then use this device. In this case, this is just a smart thermostat to then pivot to either other sections of the network or upload their own modified version of that firmware that includes some sort of backdoor or remote access, right? So I don't know about you, but for me, I don't like the idea of not having functioning air conditioning with this latest heat. But that's it for news here today in the IoT world.
So on that last bit, if anybody wanted to get more information about that vulnerability in the Bosch, where would they go to be able to find out more information?
Yeah, there's a couple sources. I'll include links. We can always send those out, but one of those is the actual Bosch website. So a lot of these vulnerabilities are disclosed publicly, thankfully. Bosch is really good at updating that. But there's also, right in our product, we have the ability to actually detect that. So if they wanted to, if they were a customer of ours, they could actually find detail directly in our product because we actually show vulnerability information when we detect it, including links to the manufacturer's website.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, let me get my presentation back up here again, and we can get started. But great. So, James, you talking about these vulnerabilities. So, what's the deal with all these vulnerabilities anyway? Haven't we figured out how to code securely after all this time? And how is it that we can reintroduce vulnerabilities that were previously patched? Haven't we got regression testing down? I'm
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm looking for you for all the answers, James.
I like to think I have all of them, but I'm not sure that I do. But I can tell you the regression testing concept is the big problem these days because back in the day, historically, regression testing was 4, 5, 6 versions back. You didn't have to worry that much because the firmware was relatively new, the device family was new, or the code was new. Now we've been doing this for so long that regression testing, you actually have to go back 10, 15 years sometimes to ensure that some of these packages don't re-expose themselves in newer versions of your firmware. And that's what we're seeing here today is this concept of regression testing being forgotten about almost in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. So let us get back here to this question and why we call this session the problem with firmware. So for those of you who don't know, we had a previous episode where we talked about firmware. And here's on the screen, I have some of the highlights of why we said it was a problem. A key one, there's a lack of standards across XIoT in the first place on secure coding or what firmware needs to look like. Quite often we see things with insecure network ports open when they get installed. And then just the whole methodology around making sure that they're updated is varied, widely varied, and not consistent at all. And most people aren't following it anyway. And it is really common for firmware developers to reuse code. And if they do use either open source code like OpenSSH, or they use some third-party code, sometimes it's really, really difficult to make sure everything is updated. And if something like a third-party code becomes compromised, the amount of time that it might take for that to get patched could be a long time. And that third-party code and open source code, sometimes some of the base of this code has been out here for a long, long time. Now, as we talked about before, we as security professionals, we need to make sure that we are making sure that XIoT manufacturers are keeping on top of this. And we're asking the questions of those manufacturers. Okay, how do we address this? If this firmware becomes compromised in some way, if there's some vulnerability, how are you making sure that it's up to date and secure and that we won't be vulnerable? And then we get to a situation like what just happened. We get this acknowledgement of this new critical vulnerability. CVE 2024-6387, affectionately called regreSSHion. I keep trying to make it sound cool with the SSH out, and I haven't figured it out yet. But so what actually happened here? There was a vulnerability in OpenSSH that was originally patched in 2006. This vulnerability allowed for, in certain circumstances, remote execution of code in a non-authenticated fashion. Well, that was patched, but somehow or another, and it hasn't come to light yet, that has been reintroduced probably in 2019. 2020 is when they think it actually was reintroduced. And what that means is, for all of this time, where we thought that this one condition, this one vulnerability was actually patched, has been reintroduced, and we never did the testing afterwards to make sure that it didn't creep back in. So 4 years later, now it's been discovered, and Qualys is the one who first reported this and did some testing on it, which shows that this vulnerability has been back in there again. Again, it allows for remote execution of code in an unauthenticated fashion with certain versions of OpenSSH server, which is really, really key and really, really critical. Now, one of the things that just blew me away is that their search in using Shodan and other tools is that they said there's about 14 million different instances of SSH that's publicly available on the internet. vulnerable SSH servers that are out there, which is a huge, huge concern. And so, and a massive reach inside of what this vulnerability is. And so we all start trying to figure out, what do we do? And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to kind of shine a light on what a release of a notice like this actually would mean. So first off, how do you actually find out about an issue like this? What ends up happening? You may get a NIST or CISA feed or an alert that might be able to tell you that there's an issue with this OpenSSH server. You're reading cybersecurity news and one of those publications put something out. Hopefully you have a good community of cybersecurity professionals around you that you can pull and share information from, maybe information sharing within your industry as well. And likely it happens all the time, is that you get your news from a vendor like Phosphorus, who's trying to keep on top of these types of issues and make sure that our customers actually know and have an approach to be able to address this. And we're going to show you a little bit later in regards to that. But as you can see, just me throwing that out, there's no consistency in what has happened. The information is not always completely clear. The guidance around what you should be doing is not always clear either. And your specific circumstance within your organization, you may not be prepared to be able to take a critical vulnerability that's now out in the wild, and how do you address it? So now we find out about it. The next thing is, well, how do we react? And if we all know, and more over the last 10 years, the questions of security is more and more a board level question. And the question comes back to being very simple. If there's some issue with a vulnerability out in the wild, what is our exposure? What is our risk? That's what leadership asks. And so you and I, if we get that, we see a vulnerability, we start thinking, well, how am I going to answer that question? How quickly can I go back and start answering that question? So what do? We hit the panic button, right? We all panic, right? First and foremost. What we do is we start looking at what we know first. We focus at the things that are probably most appropriate. We focus at, where's our sensitive data? Where's our identities? Where are the things that we can't afford to lose? And will the vulnerability affect any of those things first? Very appropriate first look is to say, if something was to be compromised, are those things secure or not? And then we address taking care of that first. We start asking ourselves some questions. The first thing is, well, where is SSH actually being used inside of my environment in this case? Where is SSH being used? Where might I have OpenSSH running? Pretty much obvious in a lot of these. Your mind's going to go right to all your Linux servers that you have, and that you're going to be looking at, maybe some third-party applications that you have, that you've invested in, that you have running, and that you're going to look at those and try to decide what those actual servers and applications are, and then make a decision. Okay, should we go in and see if we can turn off SSH? Can we block them in some way on the network? What can we do to modify that until a patch comes out? Because, by the way, there isn't a patch yet for this vulnerability. I just looked about an hour ago on the CISA site just to see if there'd been any updates, and I hadn't seen any yet. And then finally, we start thinking, well, what might be communicating? So maybe I'll just start looking at my network monitoring tools to say, hey, is there anything communicating over SSH? Can I see something happening? It gets to be very tricky, because then you're only looking at things that are actually communicating, not if it is actually installed, vulnerable, running on any device or any type of server, only if it's communicating. And you may get a little bit of a satisfaction of knowing that, oh, I know where some of this communication is happening, but it still is a huge, huge blind spot. So now we're reacting and feeling good about our traditional IT side of things. But here's where the big trick is. Do you know that you actually have a big gap? Do you know how many IoT devices actually have SSH embedded in it? Because I will tell you, there are so many pieces of firmware that have Linux kernels embedded in that and may have SSH. They may have SSH services running on those as well. When you look around, even if you look around and see, how many do you see inside of your environment? Do you see a lot of cameras? Those cameras likely may have OpenSSH running on it. It's not common, by the way, to actually know. It's not common for you or anybody else in security to actually know where you're compromised in an XIoT environment. And most of the time, just like this ostrich on the screen, we stuck our heads in the ground and said, that part of the business I'm just going to trust is going to be taken care of, and I'm going to go concentrate on my regular Linux servers. And part of the reason here is we know sometimes it's hard to get the visibility of it. It's hard to understand. We concentrate a lot on saying, well, what do I have? I have a whole database or a whole spreadsheet of all of the cameras and the printers and the PLCs and the door controllers that I have and their IP addresses. So I know where they're at, but I don't have a specific understanding of what they're running, if SSH is running or any other service that might be running and exposed. And then not only that, but when I turn around to say, how can I remediate this and how can I change it or how can I fix it? There isn't a way. It becomes, when we look at it, it seems like an unmanageable and unattainable kind of goal to be able to do that. But it's incredibly important. As I like to say here, just knowing that you have a camera is not enough. You need to be able to continuously monitor that camera for its current posture. It's like what we normally do in IT. We need to have solutions in place to understand the state of the devices we have, because this SSH vulnerability, there's going to be another one followed up. We already talked about the Bosch temperature controller. These things will continue to pop up. And for your ability to have across the entire estate, an understanding of what things might be running, what things are exposed in a very quick and easy fashion is going to become more and more key. And working with vendors like Phosphorus, organizations like Phosphorus, and a bunch of other organizations that are looking to try to make sure that you have the best visibility is going to be a key thing to put in place. Wouldn't it be nice if you had the button to push to say, show me where all my XIoT devices are that are actually vulnerable to this, or that actually have this vulnerability in there. And then I can maybe make some decisions about how I'm going to change it. So I want to hand back over to James. James, interested to know, after I've talked about that, what your technical take is here.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to consider here. So I'm going to actually share my screen as well here for a moment, because I want to talk through this concept. There's a couple things at play here. One is understanding where you're actually exposed to a vulnerability like this is not an easy thing, right? You've talked about that here. It's a little easier to figure out on the IT side of the house because there's a lot of tools, a lot of maturity in that space to try and identify specific versions or application, instances that are running on a desktop or a laptop. But when you think about the IoT space or the XIoT space, that's a much more difficult problem because most of the tools on the market today will give you a rough estimate of where you might be exposed to something like this, because they'll say, hey, we saw that device, it was running SSH, you should check it out. But oftentimes those tools don't give you the kind of granularity that you need to actually know and measure your risk. And so they're going to tell you that a device is running SSH, but they're not going to tell you which version of SSH it's running, right? They're not going to tell you what the settings of that device are. So there's going to be some nuance there that's actually incredibly important when you're considering or trying to measure risk and exposure to something like this. And I want to show just really quickly here how easy that is with a platform like Phosphorus to kind of do that discovery. So I'm going to put in here a search query. This is a whole lab environment where all of our devices exist. And so what I can do is do a very quick paste here of a command. And what this command is, it's a very long string of text, but it's very simple. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, query all the devices on my network and show me a list of every single device that has a version of SSH running on it that we know to be vulnerable to this exploit? Simple. I hit enter, and now I return a list of not every device in my environment running SSH. That's not your exposure. The exposure is actually the specific versions of SSH that are running. And now I've got a very quick list, because what happens is most organizations are going to use their other tools that they've got in place and show this long list of hundreds or thousands of devices that might be exposed, when the reality of their exposure is actually a much smaller piece of that pie, because now we can actually act on this data. Now I can look at this and say, okay, this is an access camera. We know it's got an SSH server running on it, but we also know specifically which version of SSH is running. And that's the key here, is that we can actually show, hey, this is running SSH 9.6. And we know that OpenSSH 9.6 is part of that vulnerability suite. And so for me, having that kind of actionable detail is really helpful if you're trying to measure risk and understand where you're exposed. But we'll take it one step further. How do we fix that? How do we actually mitigate this risk? Because sticking it on its own VLAN, not really mitigating the risk. It's putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, right? It's not going to help that much. But actually fixing the problem, fixing the underlying issue, which in this case here, if you look at this metadata, we can actually see on the device right now, SSH is enabled. That's a problem. So with Phosphorus, you just go in, we can create a job that says, hey, for all of my XIoT devices that match this string or this criteria, change SSH to disabled. Problem solved, right? Now you're no longer exposed. But like you mentioned as well, Huck, and I think this is an important note, it's not just about doing that single point in time query and understanding where your risk is today. Because if we do that query, we find all these devices, we fix them, but what happens in a week, 2 weeks, a month, when one of those devices gets reset to the manufacturer's defaults? What happens when they go in and do upgrades on all of their hardware and put in a whole bunch of new cameras, right? That might also have this, right? It's about doing that ongoing and continuous maintenance and monitoring of that infrastructure to make sure that your exposure doesn't creep back into a high-risk environment, right? And the last thing I'll note here is, I think with this vulnerability specifically, the exposure that XIoT has to it is actually greater than traditional IT assets. Because if you think about what it takes to actually leverage this exposure, this vulnerability, you have to send something like 10,000 plus commands or 10,000 strings to the device, to OpenSSH, to actually unlock the ability to exploit that, which is why right now it's a vulnerability versus an actual active exploit, because it's something that's actually hard or difficult to reproduce in the wild. IoT is a lot more susceptible to that kind of an attack, because they're not being monitored as closely. They're a little bit more resilient to a basic command, as long as the command itself is sent in the right way, and an attacker would know how to do that. We're not doing things like rate control on an IoT device like a camera. The camera is just going to keep taking that request and not care. But again, none of these traditional IT tools are monitoring for that on an IoT device. They are on a server, right? You try to send 10,000 commands to a server, SecOps is going to notice that, right? But you do that to a camera, they may not. And so I think that's where this exposure is a little bit unique to the XIoT space.
All right, fantastic. And just for everybody to know, that query string that James showed, that is something that we provided to our customers to be able to say, hey, here's a simple way for you to be able to filter out just to the things that you need to look at inside of the Phosphorus solution. But our whole methodology and the way we've built this is to expose the most important things for you to be able to look at on these devices at a large scale. So thank you very much, James, for being able to kind of go through that. And so addressing this issue as ones that come up into the future, it really is about, do I have a handle on what's happening in that space? And can I remediate quickly and at scale? And that's got to be the big question for all of you. And for us here at Phosphorus, we are happy to have that kind of discussion on how we can help at any time. So let's pause there and then head to Q&A. If there's any questions that you specifically have, you can put it into the Q&A box, and James or I will we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, we do have one already that I want to talk to really quickly because I think it's actually interesting. There's a question about somebody who's essentially an SMB, small to mid-sized business consultant. They're looking to help the kind of the small to mid market from a retail or restaurant chain standpoint manage some of their IoT. And I think there's something unique about that space, about kind of that small to medium sized restaurant or retail business, because they oftentimes have a bunch of locations, right? They might have 10, 15, 20 locations. And when you start talking about businesses that have such a large kind of geo-dispersed presence like that, managing anything in that kind of an environment can get really difficult because the economy of scale is hard to manage. Plus, the networking, the topology of everything is a lot more difficult to navigate. And so traditional methods to try and solve this problem with IoT products, where you've got to deploy hardware and you have to consume network traffic and do all the kind of passive monitoring techniques, that doesn't work really well in that space, because they're not going to be able to afford the hardware investment that's required. And they're probably not going to have the technical abilities to actually implement that at scale and in a meaningful way. And so something like Phosphorus is great because it's such a easy plug and play solution, in the sense that we can just simply go out there with either a SaaS based, sitting in the customer's Azure AWS environment, or in this case, it's more likely they've just got an ESX server somewhere in a closet at, in one of their kind of core locations. We can actually, through that single virtual instance, go out and do discovery across all of those different locations. And so we don't have to have that hardware presence at every single one of those retail locations or restaurants, right? And I think that's a huge component there, because it simplifies the deployment model, but it also simplifies the economic model, right? You don't have to make that huge initial investment in hardware to solve this problem.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions from the audience? There was a question, do we know if the vulnerability has been actively exploited since the Qualys report last week on July 1st? Don't know. Our CISO, John Terrell, who we've had on the webinar in the past, has been actively on top of that, looking for it. We haven't seen an exploit yet, outside of the work that a few of the security teams have done to prove out the concept, and that's it.
Yeah, the big thing with that is it's actually really hard to reproduce this issue or the exploit because of the technical kind of mechanisms behind the scene. However, now that it's public, now that it's known that this exists, and not only public, but on such a huge amount of devices and servers across the world, it's only a matter of time before a more simplified version of the exploit hits the market. It's going to happen.
Perfect. All right. Want to thank everybody for joining again. I'll leave you all with this. To be able to, if you go onto our website, you can take what we call our 15, 30, 60 challenge, which demonstrates to you how we can find XIoT devices in 15 minutes, help you start hardening them in 30 minutes, and remediating issues in 60 minutes or less. So great to have you all here. Thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks for our next session.